Hello, everyone. My name is Eric. I'm a limited licensed master social worker and psychotherapist. I've been working with children, youth, and adults for 10 years. There are millions, if not billions, of people on this planet who do not understand themselves. You may think that's quite an egregious assumption. You might even feel personally offended by that statement. But as a psychotherapist, I can admit that I don't even fully understand myself. The people that I've worked with throughout my career are seemingly no closer than I to fully understanding the intricacies of who they are, or why they do the things they do, or why they react to things the way they do. While there's 1,000 different ways of getting to know yourself, whether that's through activities like journaling, self-reflection, meditation, or through an honest assessment of your personal strengths and weaknesses, one of the ways I like to introduce my patients to the other side of themselves is by lifting the veil on their unconscious defense mechanisms. We all get defensive about things, and that's fairly common, and it's usually on full display for everyone to see. When someone gets defensive about something, it's immediately apparent, and it's usually awkward or uncomfortable for everyone. When we get defensive, we suddenly feel the urge to fight, protest, or run. Why do we do these things? Let me tell you, it's not a mystery. And with decades of experience working with people, I can pretty accurately point out defenses that people habitually and unconsciously employ to keep themselves grounded and stable in shaky interpersonal situations. This video is going to serve as part 1 of a dedicated and detailed explanation with numerous examples of primary and secondary defense mechanisms. Some of them you know, some of them you do, and some of them you've likely never heard of before. So, with that being said, let's get right into it. What are primary and secondary defense mechanisms? Defense mechanisms are best described as unconscious integrations of experiences, usually thought of as maladaptive, but higher order secondary defenses can be adaptive and healthy. Similar in the concept of cognitive distortions in cognitive theory, but different because distortions are purely cognitive and influence perceptions of people, places, and events, whereas defense mechanisms can be cognitive, emotional, and behavioral ways of integrating experiences. According to Nancy McWilliams, they have 2 fundamental purposes. 1, the avoidance or management of some powerful or threatening feeling, usually anxiety, but sometimes overwhelming grief, shame, envy, or other disorganizing emotional experiences, and 2, the maintenance of self-esteem. These defenses are, for the most part, socially learned and conditioned throughout life as a result of a complex interaction among at least 4 factors. 1, one's constitutional temperament. 2, the nature of the stresses that one suffered in early childhood. 3, the defense modeled and sometimes explicitly taught by parents or caregivers. And 4, the experienced consequences of using particular defenses. Now that we better understand what defense mechanisms are, let's briefly discuss the difference between primary and secondary, or sometimes referred to as immature and mature defense mechanisms. Primary or immature defense mechanisms involve the boundary between the self and the outer world, whereas secondary or mature defenses relate to internal boundaries, such as those between the id, ego, and superego, or between the observing and experiencing parts of the ego. This would be, in Jungian psychology, the difference between the ego and the persona. The so-called primary defenses are the ways in which an infant naturally perceives the world, and secondary defenses are learned and conditioned as a person matures. For a deeper understanding of defenses and their relation to the psychosexual stages of development, read Anna Freud's The Ego and Mechanisms of Defense. In classical psychoanalysis, it is believed that a person, at the time of a psychological experience that they are unable to integrate, gets locked into a particular phase of psychosexual development, and that this inhibition in psychological growth leads to the frustration that is the psychogenesis of psychological pathology. The sequence of the idea is that an anal character is someone whose unmanageable experience occurred during the years of toilet training, and now they are governed by internal rules and expectations of control and release and the conflict over whether or not to express anger. their primary childish defense mechanism of acting out, is by definition a compulsive strategy employed to maintain a sense of control and mastery over their disorienting thoughts and feelings. This person would have obsessive compulsive disorder, or obsessive compulsive personality disorder. Primary defense mechanisms. Extreme withdrawal. Extreme withdrawal is most evident in socially anxious, depressed, and schizophrenia spectrum illnesses and personality types. Nancy McWilliams writes, "An infant who is overstimulated or distressed will often simply fall asleep. Withdrawal into a different state of consciousness is an automatic, self-protective response that one sees in the tiniest human beings." As cute as this is to think about, the subjective experience of the infant is anything but cute. If you can imagine an experience so completely overwhelming that the only thing you can do to escape it is to fall asleep, you will understand how much of a last-ditch effort extreme withdrawal can be. I worked with a patient with bipolar disorder whose days mostly consist of sleeping because he prefers to sleep rather than to face the overwhelming pressure of consciousness. Those are his words, not mine. Denial. Denial is probably the most obvious example of an immature defense mechanism seen not only in children but in adults as well. But denial comes in many different forms. Not only do people deny wrongdoing, but in a lot of cases they also deny reality as a whole. Examples of people for whom denial is the bedrock defense are the Pollyanna-like individuals who insist that everything is always fine and for the best. People will even go so far as to say things like, "If God says it's my time, then it's my time," and they will refuse life-saving treatments because they actually believe that the cost and associated debt of medical treatment in America is worse than death. Omnipotent control. Omnipotent control is the belief that one has the unlimited ability to control situations or events, or that something or someone else has control. They learn this as children through the successful conditioning and manipulation of their parents. McWilliams writes, "For the newborn, the world and the self are more or less one. When a child smiles, their parents smile back, or at least the good ones do. When they scream, their parents come running. When they cry, their parents give them a bottle or change their diaper. For the child, all of this conditions them to believe that they are controlling their parents. If the defense continues into adulthood, we run into problems because, as we know, we have very little control over anything. The conviction that individuals can do anything they set their mind to is a piece of American ideology that flies in the face of common sense and most human experience. But, nonetheless, it can be a powerfully positive and self-fulfilling fiction. I have worked with many survivors of trauma who have survivor's guilt that results from the defense of omnipotent control. They believe that if they only left the house 5 minutes later, they could have avoided that tragic accident. And this is a complex mixture of denial, omnipotent control, and rationalization. Extreme idealization and devaluation. A characteristic defense in borderline personality organizations, extreme idealization and devaluation is typically referred to in those with a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder. However, it is a mistake to say that this only happens in people with BPD, and understanding the difference between the DSM-5-TR diagnostic category of borderline personality disorder and the psychoanalytic category of borderline personality organization is helpful because idealization and devaluation is a defense that is typically associated with all cluster B personality disorders. This includes narcissistic personality, histrionic personality, antisocial personality, and BPD. McWilliams says, "People who live their lives seeking to rank all aspects of the human condition according to how comparatively valuable they are, and who appear to be motivated by a search for perfection through the merger with idealized objects, efforts to perfect the self, and tendencies to contrast the self with devalued alternatives, have narcissistic personalities. Their need for constant reassurance of their attractiveness, power, fame, and value to others results from depending on these defenses. Self-esteem strivings in people who need to idealize and devalue are contaminated by the idea that one must perfect the self rather than accept it. In borderline personality disorder, this mechanism results in splitting, which most people think of as the separation of the good and bad parts of the self and others, being split and fundamentally irreconcilable. Today, they're in love with their partner and they're the greatest person in the world. Tomorrow, their partner is a lying piece of shit who doesn't deserve them or anyone else. The inability to accept nuances, and that people are inherently a mixture of good and bad qualities, is part of the reason for why these people have such unstable relationships with others as well as themselves. I once worked with a woman with BPD who told me that her husband of 8 years kept her financially afloat, but otherwise could not think of a single positive quality about him. I told her that I simply cannot believe that anyone would stay with a person for 8 years without any positive qualities, and that she should think harder. This comment angered her, but it was obvious to me that her defenses had hardly, if ever, been challenged up until she met me. Soon after, she told me that I was the worst therapist ever and that I shouldn't ever work with people, and then told a colleague of mine that I was a great therapist and that we just didn't work out. In order to keep this video at a reasonable length, I'm going to continue this detailed explanation of the psychological defense mechanisms in a series of follow-up videos. It is likely that there will be a part 2, 3, and 4 in order to cover all of the primary and secondary defenses in detail. If you enjoyed this video, I would appreciate it if you gave it a thumbs up and left a comment down below. If you're interested in further reading and want to get ahead, you can find all of the information directly from the source in Nancy McWilliams' Psychoanalytic Diagnosis, Understanding Personality Structure in the Clinical Process, 2nd edition. Otherwise, another impressively readable volume on psychological defense mechanisms is Joseph Burgo's Why Do I Do That? This is Psych.osophy, and thank you for your support. Until next time.